Welcome everyone to the seventh week of MarshWatch. I can't believe it's been seven so far. I just want to let you know that I'm here today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, encompassing the homelands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. I, of course, am your host, Leanne Latrimoy, and I work for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a national nonprofit with a mission to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds in Canada. Okay, on the docket for tonight, we've got some bird and amphibian ID, and I'm also going to mention that this year is a piping plover census, and there are some basins that are, needing surveyed around the Saskatoon area. Um, I think all of the basins are covered in Alberta and Manitoba already, but the Saskatchewan census, still needs a few hands to help. So if you're interested, we'll talk about that later. And then, of course, we'll do the quizzes and the discussion period afterwards, and we won't record that portion of the event. Okay, for today, we've got some bird species for you, and some of them are kind of paired up with similar looking species. So we've got the Marsh Wren and the Sedge Wren, which are both small little wren species that inhabit wetlands that are more often heard than seen. We've got the common Yellowthroat, Northern Harrier. Those are kind of standalone-ish, but we're gonna delve into trying to tell the two, paler terns apart, the common tern and the Forster's tern, as well as some pretty large, noisy shorebirds. We've got the Willet and the marbled Godwit. And I didn't add them to this slide, but we're also going to be covering the tiger salamanders because I had a request to do that and I thought it was a fantastic idea. So I've added those at the end of today's presentation. Okay, first off, we've got a sedge wren. And sedge wrens are aptly named. They like these sedgy, class 3 wetland habitats where it's really like lots of tall grasses, lots of tall sedges. They look like grasses, but they have really sharp edges to their leaves. This isn't a hard and fast rule, though. They can find themselves into deeper wetland habitats on occasion. So, don't just go by the habitat alone, but it is a pretty good indication of, where they like to hang out. Both of these wrens are very, very small, and they're both brownish. They're way more often heard than seen, in part because, it isn't a very large bird. If you're seeing a yellow-headed blackbird, even at a fair distance, it's really easy to tell what that is. But trust me, if you're seeing a tiny brown blob at, 200 meters away, you're not going to be able to tell what it is by sight, and you might even be far enough away that you can't hear it. So, the two wrens are small-ish and brownish, and both of them, they're very, very vocal. They're very, very active. They sing throughout the day, throughout the night. They often have little tails cocked up, and they've got these fine little bills. They don't really look like a sparrow or anything. They've got little pointy bill. If you're ever familiar with sparrows, they tend to have these conical shaped bills, but the wrens, they don't have that. They're primarily insect eaters. So little stiff tails that they often have cocked up, and they're just always very busy. So the sedge wren, it's a very small little guy, compact with a relatively short bill. The sexes look the same. They're overall kind of this pale buffy or this kind of sandy, beigey color. And there's a heavy, extensive barring on the wings, tail, and it kind of blends into this streaky looking back, making it really overall kind of busy on the wings, tail, and back. There is a little bit of an eyebrow stripe, that little supercilium there, but it's not contrasting. And it'll be contrasting when we take a look at the marsh wren. But just know, like, it does have a little pale eyebrow, but it doesn't stand out. It's not the thing that's jumping out at you. Really, overall, that it's small and it's covered in this heavy barring on those wings, the back, and the tail. Like I mentioned on the outset, this is going to be a wren that you'll find in dense sedges and grasses on the margins of wetlands. You'll even find them sometimes if it's a particularly wet meadow habitat. They will, if it's maybe something that's spring fed, that's, continuously moist and wet, you can find them in those. You'll often sometimes see them in hay fields, especially here in Saskatchewan, because some of those get flooded periodically to help grow a little bit better hay. What do they eat? Well, they mostly just eat insects and spiders, and they do that by bouncing around the vegetation and gleaning their prey off of it or, catching them on the ground. But really, they kind of use their little forcep like bill to just grab tiny little insects and spiders and I'm sure they might grab other little critters that they might come across, but anything that's, small enough and is going to be, soft for it to eat. They make these really neat nests. They're kind of these globe-shaped balls of rushes and cattails, and they will build multiple nests. The marsh wrens do this as well. Some of it is thought to be, maybe it's the male being like, look at how productive I am, look at these beautiful nests. It's also thought that it might act as a bit of a deterrent for predators. If a predator keeps pulling apart these grassy balls and finding nothing in it, it might, move on. So it's not totally clear as to, what all the purpose of it serves, but those are, two relatively strong hypotheses of, why they might build all of these multiple nests. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a bird that you are way more often going to hear than you are going to see, and you'll have a much better chance at identifying it. Sometimes, they're only up for just a split second, and there's no way usually you're going to tell, especially, those ones where there's grassy habitat next to the cattails. They'll find themselves in the cattails in that kind of instance as well. They're not, totally tied to that sedgy habitat. So just want to drive that point home. Even though they're called sedge wren, they can be found in sometimes in the deeper water. It's not totally a hard and fast habitat preference. So this kind of sounds like I liken it to a bit of a sewing machine. It has a couple of distinct intro notes and then a very mechanical machine-like rattle. So I'll play that for you here. And it doesn't change very much. It never gets very musical. It's really those chick chick chick, or however many intro notes, maybe just two. So a couple of chick chick intro notes and then a rattle that really, I think, sounds a lot like a sewing machine. I'll play that once more for you here. And it's really a very unmusical, mechanical sounding rattle. You're going to see sedge wrens over, a fairly wide swatch of, kind of central and eastern North America. So you're likely to see them in a bunch of different places. If you're in Alberta, there's going to be, less places where you can see them. So just come on over and visit your neighbors. We'll be happy to share. Okay. As I mentioned, the counterpart is the marsh wren. It is also, small, compact, little wren. It tends to have like a longer bill relative to its body size compared to the sedge wren. And don't worry, we'll compare them side by side in a second here. A little bit longer bill, but overall, it's much more of a rusty, darker brown. It's got some barring on the wings and tail, but you'll notice it's got this pale, or not pale, but this plain patch on the wing right here. And for me, that's always one of my bigger tells. If I'm looking at the wing of, this photographed wren or a wren through binoculars, if it has that big blob of just plain stuff on its kind of, upper wing area, I know that we're going to be having, and it's in a wetland, I know we're going to be having a marsh wren. As I also mentioned, that eyebrow is a lot wider, that supercilium line, so it contrasts with the rest of the face. It doesn't blend in like it did in the sedge wren. And the cap is actually a fair bit darker as well than the rest of the wren. So it does look a little bit different, it has a little bit of this kind of pale throat going on, but still has that kind of, barring on parts of the wing and parts of the tail, but less so on the upper wing and back so much. So that is the marsh wren. It does also build those nice globe-shaped nests, and it does tend to be found in deeper water wetlands, often the ones where you're going to be seeing cattails and bulrushes. So on average, if you see like this nice great big swath of cattail and bulrushes, very likely you're going to have a marsh wren in there. There might be some sedge wren sneaking around, but this is definitely where the marsh wren likes to be. And you can see in the bottom photo here, it's a little bit blurrier. It's not quite in focus. It's a little bit farther away. And that whitish eyebrow really stands out against the rest of the kind of darker cap and rest of the face. I don't focus so much on the white throat. That eyebrow stripe that's nice and white and contrasting with the rest of the face really stands out. Here, unfortunately, that pale or that plain patch on the wing is obscured by the cattail, but that's life. That's usually how you're going to be seeing the bird. It's almost never ideal. Similarly, these guys are going to be gleaning prey off the vegetation in the ground, focusing on insects, aquatic ones as well, and spiders. So anything that's kind of creepy crawly wandering around the marsh habitat. They also make these lovely little globe-shaped nests, and they tend to be made out of a bit more, bulrushes and cattails, not so much the sedges and cattails. So there's often you can see these roundish stems being used in this nest. They're really quite interesting. I've run into several in my time as I walked around a wetland for science. So they're really neat little critters. And the song is still sort of similar to the Sedge Wren, but it's more a variable gurgling rattle that's more musical. And I find it almost sounds like it's taking like a little bit of an intake breath and then kind of doing this gurgly song. And the song will vary even even in an individual in between, bouts of the song. So I'll play that for you here and we'll compare the two in a second, but see if you can hear it sounding a bit more gurgly, maybe a little bit more musical, not quite as a mechanical staccato rattle. So that is the more musical, more variable rattle song of the Marsh Wren. I'll play it again for you. Oops. No, I won't. It disappeared. Okay, Marsh Wren has a bit wider distribution than the Sedge Wren did, so it's going to be found, over a greater swath of North America during the breeding season. And in some places, it's going to be resident year-round. Okay, let's compare these two cute little brownish wrens side by side. So to me, whenever I'm seeing these things, the first thing I'm drawn to is the face. Is there that bold, contrasting eyebrow stripe, that little white supercilium that we're seeing? And it's bold and contrasting on the marsh wren, and it's just not really contrasting at all. It's not very bold. It's just kind of faintly there on the sedge wren. And then next, I go to all of these little patterns on the wing here in the upper back. So on the Sedge Wren, it's going to be much more, consistent in all of that barring and those stripes along the back. Whereas in the Marsh Wren, we're going to have this patch of just plain brownish feathers. And overall, the Marsh Wren tends to look a bit darker than the Sedge Wren, which looks a little bit more buffy if you're just seeing them at a distance. But honestly, this is two species where if I just see a small wren that's kind of happens to pop up out of the vegetation and fly back down, because sometimes they'll sing like that, they'll deliver their song. It's really cute. They'll fly up, chest puffed out, and then they'll sing as they kind of flutter down into the vegetation. If I'm just seeing that really quickly, unless I'm hearing the song, if I'm just seeing them quickly, they're tough to tell apart by sight. It's not something that's always possible to do. So if you do get a good look and they're perched for a couple of seconds, those are the pointers. But otherwise, you're really going to be focusing on the vocalizations. And because they're such busy little, critters, they're going to be singing a heck of a lot for you, even throughout a fair bit of the day. They go all night. They actually quiet down a little bit at sunset for a short period of time, but then they pick back up. So we'll go start the more gurgling rattle of the marsh wren, a little bit more musical, way more variable. So much more chittery, much more rambly sounding. And the Sedge Wren really has that mechanical staccato kind of intro notes and then a sewing machine like rattle. And they're pretty consistent in having those intro notes before the rattle. And that really separates them from the marsh wren, which, has this gurgling, kind of rambly song that sometimes fades into itself. And there isn't these kind of distinct breaks with that kind of, you know, defined intro notes versus, the sedge wren, which really does have those intro notes. So I'll play each of them again. Play the marsh wren once more here. And our Sedge Wren. And again, there does tend to be habitat preferences. Marsh wrens, you'll find them in the deeper marshes where you'll be seeing bulrush and cattail, and sedge wren tends to be on the shallower margins, wet meadows, sedge marshes. But again, that line can be blurred because water draws down, and for whatever reason, a sedge wren decides it likes being in an area that you wouldn't normally associate it with. So just keep that in mind that it can be a useful starting point, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Okay, next up is a common little warbler species that inhabits wetlands pretty frequently, but it also inhabits, brushy, dense, low vegetation. So you can find them well away from wetlands as well, but this is going to be the only warbler that you'll be seeing kind of within your wetland. So small little guy. Warblers in general are very small, very active birds. If you've ever tried to go, birding in a forested setting, or even on migration, the warblers are those tiny little active guys that don't hardly sit still at all. They're always moving around. They're not going to give you nice long looks at them for the most part. They're very, very busy. And they have small, tiny little pointed bills, and that's because they feed much in the same way as our wrens, where they're going to be using that as like fine little tweezers to grab insects and stuff off of, vegetation and out of crevices and stuff like that. So fine little pointed bill. The males are really quite distinct. They've got this, bright, or not bright, but this bold black, bandit looking mask. So this mask that covers much of the face. It's edged in white on top, and they have this gorgeous yellow throat that kind of, fades into a paler belly color. On their back, they're really plain. They don't have any barring on their wings or their tail, but it's going to be this kind of, I don't know how you call that, like dull olive brown is how I described it on the slide. And this is also a bird that is really active. So the males sing a fair bit, and they'll do variations on witchy, 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 witch, or witchity, 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 variations on that sort of theme, often repeated somewhere between 3 to 4 times. Kind of depends on the individual and how they're feeling. So let's play that witchity, witchity, witchity call of the common yellowthroat here. Play it once more. So really a strong witchity, 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 or witchy, 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 very consistent in terms of like those are kind of the syllables that they say, and it does vary a little bit between kind of 3 to 4 times how often they do the witchy. Females, on the other hand, are quite drab, quite plain. They're also pretty small, very much like the males, and they're just overall they're drab olive brown. There is variable amounts of yellow on the throat. Some females, just have a bit more of a pale patch. Others have a stronger yellowish patch, but their face is totally plain. There is a, faint eye ring on there. There's no wing bars. They're really going to be this kind of plain olive colored bird in the wetland. And especially, once migration season has passed and you don't have any migrants, this is really going to be the dull kind of olive green warbler that you have in your wetland. The females are often the ones, going around carrying food. They're a lot more secretive than the males that kind of like to sing up and, perch and sing their beautiful songs. So, you know, less likely to see the females. I've definitely seen far more males than I have females, but one thing is that the throat does contrast with the rest of the body color and the face. So little contrast there on the throat and rest of the face, but otherwise a very, very plain bird. No, nothing bold on the face, faint little eye ring, no wing bars, nothing stripy on the tail. So that is our little female common yellowthroat. And as I mentioned, they have a similar diet to the wrens. They have that bill kind of designed for it for gleaning prey off, vegetation and the ground. So they're going to be after things like insects and spiders. And, they really like dense, low vegetation. So primarily wetlands. So this is, just often, especially here in the prairie ecosystem, this is usually where you have a lot of that dense habitat. But, I was out surveying some really, really dry, large ranches, and you're sitting there going, I'm hearing witchetty, 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 but there is nary a wetland in sight. It was just, rolling hills. And in the dense, low snowberry in kind of some of the coulees, there were common yellowthroats. And that's when I finally learned that they don't just like wetlands. They're more after that really, really dense, low, shrubby vegetation. And that just so happens to often be associated with wetlands, but not always. So something to keep in mind, we often associate, common yellowthroats as a primarily wetland species, but you can find them out in the prairie in some dense shrub anyway. So I thought that was pretty neat, and it kind of blew my mind when had that experience just a couple of years ago. So it proves you've always got more to learn. And the common yellowthroat has a massive wide distribution across North America. It's really only absent in some of the more drier areas. And again, as you head north, it kind of drops out a little bit, but widely distributed little warbler species. Okay, now for a bird that's completely different than any that we've talked about so far in the series, even, is the northern harrier. So this is going to be, the most frequently encountered raptor in and around wetlands. Kind of a medium-sized raptor. It's not big like an eagle, and it's not small like a merlin or anything. So fairly medium-sized. They have this nice slender build to them. Their wings are slender, their body's kind of slender, and their faces have that kind of distinct facial discs, very similar to owls. They have nice long wings, nice long tails, and the sexes are different. So the males are this lovely kind of pale blue and gray mixture. Their underparts are mostly grayish. There's a little bit of a, head and neck grayness going on. But on the underwing, you can see these lovely dark, tips to the primaries, and the secondaries are all tipped in black, especially visible from below as well. And one of the thing that I always focus on when I'm seeing this raptor, that both the males and the females have this bright white patch right above the tail here, right on their rump, and it is incredibly visible, in part because these guys, they cruise low over wetlands. So they're going to be flying low over fields, low over wetlands, and so you actually do get to see the tops a fair bit. So especially when they're banking or going around a little bit of a curve, take a look, and that bright white patch above a kind of a long tail, that's going to be your dead giveaway. Both the males and females have this. So pretty handsome little bird, that it's really nice kind of pale blue-gray color. The females and the juveniles both have this brownish plumage. They're brown above, they're kind of stripy below, and a little bit rusty orange on the underparts, but really the thing to focus on here is really going to be their, that white rump patch. And as you get used to spotting them, you will notice that they do have quite long wings, compared to a lot of the other raptors that you're going to be seeing. So kind of long, slender wings, a rather long tail. And I tell you, that white rump patch is just the thing to be looking for. As we've discussed with the ducks, anything that's white has a really good chance of getting noticed and standing out at a fair distance, even in poor lighting. So, pay attention to where the white is. And I'm seeing someone in the comments mentioning that the Northern Harrier did, in fact, used to be called the MarshWatch. And that is correct. I kind of like that name a little bit better for them because they really, they are often quite associated with marshes. They do nest in them, they'll nest on the ground in grassy areas and wetlands. And I've actually come across a nest of them as I was doing wetland surveys. So very shocked little young ones trying to be poofy and scary for me. So they're a quite nice bird that often cruises low, and you'll get used to them. Their flight patterns are rather different than any of the other species. There's actually a species of owl, the short-eared owl, that kind of does the same thing. It tends to cruise low over wetlands, but The short-eared owl has much shorter, rounder wings, a shorter, rounder tail. It's going to lack that bright white rump patch, and it's going to have a really flattened head. You can see the head in the northern harrier still sticks out. If this was going to be a short-eared owl, it would just be really incredibly, smooshed in and flat, much like, say like a pug or a Persian cat, where they have those incredibly flat faces. The northern harrier has a nice elongated face. So handsome birds, very wide distribution across North America. If you're tuning in today, you are likely to see them at some point or other during the year. So enjoy the northern harriers. Okay, now on to something a little bit more tricky. We talked about black tern a couple of weeks ago, and now we're at the two terns that are much more harder to tell apart. We have the common tern and the Forster's tern, which superficially look almost identical. And indeed, these are two species that if you don't get a great look at and you're still learning, you are likely to not be able to identify them. And it's not possible to identify all individuals. I go out with, some of my friends who are expert birders, and sometimes you just it was a tern because it didn't give us good enough looks at it, or we didn't get our binoculars up fast enough, or the lighting wasn't right. So just, I don't want you to stress out if you see these two birds and you think, my goodness, these look identical and it's hard. That's because it's not an easy, distinction. But hopefully with my tips, start to unlock a little bit of that mystery for you. So we're going to start off with the common tern, medium-sized tern. They're going to be both a little bit bigger than the black tern, but they're going to have nice, long, slender wings and a lovely forked tail. Both sexes look the same in both species, and in common terns, the bill tends to be more reddish with a dark tip. In Foresters, it's going to be a bit more orange red, but I find that is a terrible character to use because the subtleties of shades of red are really easily distorted by, the position of the sun. If the sun is low in the sky, they get that golden hour beautiful light. Forget it. You're not going to be able to use bill color because everything's going to take on this beautiful, reddish tone. So they do have a difference, but that's kind of like if you have the two birds in hand, maybe it's noticeable. Um, so black cap, otherwise kind of whitish and silvery. And the key here in flight for the common tern, you want to get a nice look at the back. I find that is the most reliable. And if the back and tops of the wings, and the primaries, if they're all kind of a consistent color, there can be a dark wedge in both of the species, sometimes, in the primaries over here, but overall, we're going to be looking at how consistent is the coloration from the back to the greater coverts above the primaries and the secondaries. Does it all look uniform, like mostly one shade, or is there difference? And so in the common tern, there's going to be consistency. Maybe that's the key. Maybe I just figured it out for myself. Common tern has consistent back color. Okay, I'm learning something today too, because I always have a hard time remembering which features are associated to which bird when I'm in the field. So, okay, that consistent gray over the common terns, back and wings. They do have a grayish belly, but that is subtle. It's hard to see. It can often be, mistaken for a shadow, and their bellies are often shadowed depending on how you're seeing them. And so there is a bit of a faint gray belly, but that can be really subtle and hard to see. So in flight, hopefully you get a nice look at the back, and if you got that consistent color, we're going to be having a common tern. The tail shows dark markings on the outer tail feather. Otherwise, the tail is white. So if you happen to get a look at that. And the common tern is really common on a variety of water bodies, lakes and rivers and wetlands. It nests on the ground in kind of sandy or pebbly areas. Okay, now we're looking at the Forster's tern, which is a very similar looking tern. It too has, slender wings and a forked tail, and both sexes look the same. Again, it has more of that orangey tone to the bill, but I have found this to be really tough to discern in the field. Also has a black cap, but the back and top of the wings contrast with silvery primaries, so there is some contrast here. So nice, darker coloration as you get closer to the body, and it fades out into this lovely silvery color as you get closer to the wingtip. So there, there is contrast. Oh gosh, they're both C words. That maybe that doesn't work for the common tern. At any rate, if you remember that feature, you can always look it up later. But you know, the difference in coloration can be quite stark depending on, the angle that you're getting the bird at. If it tilts just right in the light, that's going to be really helpful for you. So the back and, the secondary greater coverts over here are going to be looking a fair bit darker than the greater coverts over the primaries, and the more silvery primaries themselves will stand out. This is definitely more of a marsh-focused tern. They breed in wetlands. They'll place their nests on floating vegetation or on muskrat lodges. So they're definitely more closely associated with marshes, but both of them will go on and... Oh, Stephanie just wrote in the comments, it was great. C for consistent and common tern, and F for fading color. I love it. Thank you. I think this has just unlocked it for me personally. Um, so yes, fading color for the forester's tern, consistent color for the common tern. Thank you, Stephanie. Sometimes it's obvious and you can't really see it yourself. Anyway, so back to what I was saying. The forester's tern is definitely more of a marsh associated species, but both of the species, you'll find them foraging well away from nest sites, so it can be found, in larger lake systems as well. But if you have them nesting, if you see a nest, that's going to be a bit more of a clue as to, which species it is. The common terns are going to be nesting on sandy, gravelly areas, and the forester's tern on vegetation or muskrat lodges. Oh yes, I had a little slide to show that that's the area that we're looking for the fade. Okay, there is actually another way to tell them apart, especially if they are perched. This doesn't really work in flight so much, or really at all, I find, but if you have them perched, you can take a look at the wingtips. So these are the primary feathers, folded up nicely here. And in the common tern, they are quite dark as they're folded up. And in the forester's tern, they retain this kind of silvery look to them. So if you see these terns perched, take a look at the wing feathers. And if it's going to be nice and dark, we have a common tern, and kind of light and silvery, it's foresters. Also, there is a difference in the tail length between the two species. The common tern has a shorter tail compared to where its wingtips wind up when they're folded at rest. So shorter tail on the common, longer on the forester's tern. You can see those really long tail feathers extend well past the folded wing length. And they do sound slightly different when they're doing some calls. Oftentimes, I don't find it to be the most reliable, but the common tern tends to have more of a two-syllabled call. They do more of a kee-er, and the forester's tern really does a more keer. It's more, there's no break in it so much. So see if you can hear that difference. If you can't, don't worry. It's not necessarily the easiest character to pick up on, and I almost, never rely on it solely as a characteristic because I don't feel like I have a good enough handle on all of their vocalizations because a lot of their vocalizations sound fairly similar. So here's the key-er call of the common tern. So it sounds a bit more two-parted. There's a distinct key-er versus the forester's keer. I'll play that again because it was a short clip. So that is the difference between common and forester's while perched. So that perch can be really useful. And if you happen to see them close together, there is a little bit of a difference in the leg height, but I don't think that's, easy enough to use if you just see the bird individually. And some of it's going to depend on how they're holding their body feathers at the same time. So really that works if you have a potentially a mixed species kind of roost or flock of them. But in that kind of folded wing for the common tern, those primaries wind up looking quite dark when they're all neatly folded up. And for the forester's tern, those primary feathers look much more silvery when they're nice and folded up. So helpful little tip if you see them perched and not flying, because you can't see that contrast so well, or the fade in the forester's tern. Here's just another shot of that. Really shows, that white kind of silvery look to those long primaries. And again, that nice, really long tail. Okay, taking a look at the backs of them again. Consistent for the common all throughout the color year. It really has this kind of solid grayish look to it. And there's that fade on the foresters from the center of the back fading paler as you get out towards the wingtip. So that's going to be probably your easiest clue if you see the birds, flying around. Again, that bill, it's a bit more orangey on the foresters, but man, the light can really screw with that, making it look quite reddish, or conversely, it can look quite, bright on the common if it's in bright light. So it is maybe a useful secondary characteristic, especially if you have a mixed flock. Common tern has a nice wide distribution. It's actually circumpolar, but this is the North American swatch of that distribution. So fairly common across kind of Canada, less so in the States. And Forster's definitely has more of a kind of central distribution, especially out here on the prairies. All right. Next up, we've got a very loud, very noisy shorebird. This is a large shorebird, and this is the willet. It has kind of dark legs. They're very dull gray, has a long, straight, dark bill, and both sexes are mottled gray overall, kind of this kind of mottled, barred, little bit of flecks all over it, a palish eye ring, and especially if you get this bird stretching or flying at all, it shows these, telltale, bold black and white patches on the wings. It's really amazing because you see this otherwise kind of bland looking grayish shorebird, and then it flies and it kind of has this amazing coloration in the wing that's very contrasting, very, very stark. So it is quite noticeable as it's flying around. You'll find these guys on the edges of wetlands and ponds. They actually don't nest in the wetland themselves. They rely on having upland habitat to nest in, and then they'll make their way, with their kids to the wetland area for easier feeding, but they nest outside of the wetland. And they are extremely vocal. I've done a lot of wetland surveys, and this, along with the marbled godwit, which we'll be talking about in a second, they're both just so incredibly vigilant and loud that they'll come and start harassing you. You could be 300 meters away from their nest, and if they see you, they're going to get up and they're going to tell everyone that you're there. So very, very vocal, especially when slightly alarmed. And they'll do variations of willet, willet, or pill, will, willet, and kind of variations on that theme. So I'll play a couple of tracks here for you. And just imagine that ad nauseum as you're trying to survey for other birds. It can be quite tough. So those are two variations. We got the pill will willet, pill will willet, pill will willet, or the willet, willet, willet. I'll play those two again for you. So that is the willet for you. It's one of those birds that's gonna, for food, will walk around and steadily pick, swish, probe for food. And, a lot like many bird species, it's gonna eat whatever can fit. So that can be anything from insects, crustaceans, mollusks, out on the ocean sides, that'll be polychaete worms. It'll eat small fish, amphibians if it can catch them. So really, it's going to be eating anything animal material. You can oftentimes see them stretching their really, really bold wings here. a species that you might immediate like kind of superficially get confused might be some of the yellow legs, but as the name implies, those yellow legs do have bright yellow legs, and the willet has these very, very kind of dull gray looking legs. So just overall a very gray shorebird, and especially if you see those wings, it's going to be, telltale sign that you've got yourself a willet. But the kind of overall plain dull gray legs, dull bill, kind of, blackish, grayish, and not very, flashy body with a little bit of an eye-ring. So they're pretty cute, and like all shorebird babies, you can see this little guy here on the right-hand side. Shorebird babies are pretty cute, and his bill is or its bill is still kind of small. It's not fully grown yet, so as it grows, so will the bill. And willets have an interesting distribution. We have the western subspecies of the willet here on the prairies. As you can see, Saskatchewan does encompass a fairly large portion of a lot of that range. You'll also get some eastern willets in kind of, the north in the northeast along the seaboard there. So two different subspecies. I think the western willet is a little bit larger than the eastern, but it's been a while since I've had to brush up on my willet subspecies. Okay, another kind of similar shorebird that inhabits very similar habits or habitats and is also quite large is the marbled godwit. It's got a long, slightly upturned bill, and that bill is bicolored. It's going to be kind of orangey at the base, fading into a nice dark at the tip. It's going to have long, dark or blackish legs, and it's going to be fairly chunky bodied. This isn't a very svelte looking bird. It definitely is kind of portly. It looks like it has a little bit of a belly. Both sexes are the same, and they're kind of modeled this brown, sandy cinnamon color. They have this little dark cap, and they do have an eye line through what would otherwise be a fairly pale, little bit of their face. And they have a cinnamon patch on their upper wing. You can also see it on the underwing here. The underwings get quite cinnamony there. And as I mentioned, this is another one that really does get up and alerts everyone to your presence, whether you are anywhere near its nest or not. So they'll do much the same as the willet. And I have been, followed by these guys for several surveys. Walking a kilometer and you've got this godwit that's following you and screaming at you. They can fly quite close and yell quite loudly. And this one is another one that says its name. And they often go, Godwit, Godwit, Godwit. So see if you can hear that Godwit. So they're quite loud. It's almost like a scream call, especially when they're close to you. It's a little bit raspy. It's a little rough, but God, Godwit, Godwit, and they really get going. I'll play it once more for you. And as I mentioned, this is one that if you're anywhere near you are likely to hear it and it will be upset with you. You might not be anywhere close to its nest, and they want everybody to know that there's a potential predator in the neighborhood. You can really see some of those cinnamon patches in the wings in flight. Not always the easiest to get a photo of. This is another one that's going to, walk around and probe and pick for food and eat insects. Grasshoppers, it's especially fond of because this is another one that nests in the upland habitat and then walks down to the wetland for, a large portion of its feeding. So it will eat a lot of grasshoppers along its way. It eats aquatic plant tubers, leeches, and small fish. So you'll find this bird in areas with a mix of native prairie and wetlands of, different types. It's not necessarily consistent, but, it does like shallow mud flats. And, so those can happen in a variety of different types of wetlands, depending on how, the water levels are in that particular year. So not necessarily, looking for a typical wetland class, but it's looking for feeding habitats for the most part with some nice upland habitat nearby for nesting. So I think they're quite a handsome bird. I really love those cinnamon colors, and it really does look similar to the willet, but just much warmer colors. And unfortunately, if you want to come get a look at them, you're going to have to come out to the Northern Great Plains or trek out to the James Bay lowlands. The prairies are going to be easier to get to, I assure you, but it's a fairly limited range of the species, which sometimes is surprising. So here are those two compared. They're overall relatively similar looking, but the Willet is more this like cool gray tones, whereas the marbled Godwit is much more warm browns and cinnamon colors. That bill is going to be different, longer and more upturned in the marbled Godwit, and it's bicolored, so it's going to start off kind of orangey reddish at the base, kind of fading into dark, whereas the Willet, it's going to be, shorter, pretty straight, and, just dark overall. And again, the coloration, we're going to have a nice little eye line here for the marbled Godwit, and the Willet really just has a bit of that, pale circle around its eye, little eye ring. And in flight, the Willet is going to be pretty unmistakable. That's a really bold flight pattern on this gray little bird. And the marbled Godwit as well, these bright, lovely cinnamon patches on the wings. The only thing you might confuse that with is the long-billed curlew, which is definitely going to be more in grassland habitat, less, they don't really hang out in wetlands at all, but they have a very long, decurved bill. So that's the only other one that's going to look similar to the marbled Godwit, being that kind of rusty, warm, brownish coloration. And by special request, we're going to take a look at some tiger salamanders. So we have in the northern Great Plains, we've got two species. We have the western and the eastern, and they are really neat. I don't know, a ton about salamanders, but they're aquatic in their larval stage, and eventually they'll metamorphose out into a mostly terrestrial adult. Apparently, some adults don't necessarily go through this full process, and they kind of remain a breeding adult, but in the aquatic habitat. I don't know much more than that. Salamanders are a whole, they're interesting creatures. And there's a few subspecies of the western one, so they're a lot more variable in their coloration. Um, you know, both of these species are going to be found near sandy or, easily crumbly, friable soil around semi-permanent wetlands and fishless water bodies. And that, without fish is important because their eggs would just be super, super vulnerable, and their little tadpoles. So all of those shallow, unconnected basins that make up the prairie pothole ecosystem are really great for salamanders because almost all of them are fishless. You have to be a certain depth of wetland before you can support fish life. Even if it doesn't freeze all the way to the ground, you can get low oxygen levels because there's not a ton of water in that area. So they really thrive in this habitat. And in other places, there's other species of salamanders, but these are the two that we have, here on the northern Great Plains in Canada. We just barely get the eastern. I'll show you the range map in a second. So the eastern is going to be mostly in southeastern Manitoba, and the western you'll have from the rest of Manitoba onward into Alberta and Saskatchewan. The ones that look the most, or sorry, the subspecies that is going to be in overlap with the eastern tiger salamander is going to look a little bit different. Basically, it seems like they're going to have their spots reversed. So the eastern tiger salamander is going to look like it has, these kind of brownish yellow spots on a black background, whereas the subspecies that you're most likely to encounter in that kind of overlap or, meeting of the ranges area is going to look more like it has a orangey, or not orangey, a yellow olivey background with dark splotches over top of it. Otherwise, further away, it can look very striking. They can really have a lot of those yellow splotches on some of the subspecies, or they can really look quite dark. Most of the ones I've seen have actually looked like this bottom one here, and they just appear kind of really dark and very, very mottled overall, like kind of just this dull mixture of olive colors and black. So they're neat. The Western tiger salamander in Canada is a species at risk, and the eastern is considered extirpated from its tiny range in Ontario and is, I think, endangered in its Manitoba range. So they're they're really neat creatures. They're worth reporting. If you run into these I suggest you take a picture and you can post it up on something like iNaturalist, and a lot of the conservation data centers use that information. There's a few pictures of them here in people's hands. As with most amphibians, try to handle them as little as possible. Their skin is really porous, and so anything that you might have on your hand, like maybe you had lotion on your hand, you put it on that morning, like a lot of that can be really not great for the amphibians. And if you do handle them, make sure your hands are clean, and ideally that your hands are wet, because you know your hands will dry them out, and that's pretty uncomfortable for these little critters. I've seen them a fair bit out near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan. We had a field house, and there was, a pond where, the larvae hung out, and then we had adults, oftentimes just hanging out under our kayaks. The adults, they're terrestrial, but they need little animal burrows and soil that they can dig into to burrow in, during dry periods. So they're a neat creature. I'm going to try to learn more about them as I can, because I just think they're fascinating little creatures. And here was this really interesting diagram from one of the Kosiwick reports. I can't remember if it was from the eastern or western species, but it was, you know, interestingly painting all of these, the two species as well as all of the subspecies of the western. So I've highlighted the ones that we get in Canada. So the eastern here, you can just see a little bit of it in southeastern Manitoba. It abuts up right with the edge of the range of the western. So we got this subspecies here, and then in kind of more of this pinkish color, there's a different subspecies, but they're pretty neat. I like them a fair bit. If you do go on iNaturalist, you'll notice that the common names are different for them. Um, I think it's the Western is called the Bard, but the subs or the species names will be the same. So Abystoma mavortium for Western, and Abystoma tigrinum for the Eastern, which is also known as the tiger salamander, just the plain tiger salamander. But I think the Eastern and Western are the newer names for it to avoid confusion with some of the subspecies of others. So those are the salamanders for you. And we'll go over these birds. I saw a question in the chat. Northern harriers, they're generally pretty silent. I've only ever heard the young screech at me in a nest, so I didn't include the call of the northern harrier because I don't think it's something that I've ever heard an adult make. I'm sure they do make some sort of vocalization, but it's one of those things where it really wasn't useful in the ID process. So that's why I didn't include it for the Northern Harrier. Okay, so we got our Marsh Wren and our Sedge Wren. Variable gurgling rattle for the Marsh Wren. And our Sedge Wren has those kind of introductory chit chit notes and that harsh sewing machine like rattle. And of course, if you're looking at the two, that white eyebrow is really contrasting and stands out in the Marsh Wren. There's a bit of an eyebrow here for the Sedge Wren, but it's really not very contrasting. The Marsh Wren has this plain patch on the upper wing, so there's no barring there. And the Sedge Wren has, more consistent barring along the wing, the upper back, and the tail. So we're missing that kind of blob here on the Marsh Wren. So it's kind of a nice little patch to look at. The common yellowthroat males have this really lovely bandit mask and sing a witchety, witchety, witchety call. And of course, the northern harrier. There's that raptor that cruises low over the wetlands, and both the males and the females just so happen to have this really lovely white rump patch, which makes them super convenient and visible to see for us humans. So nice, lovely raptor there that hangs out in wetlands. We've got the difference between the common tern and the forester's tern. In flight, we're looking at the upper wing. For the common tern, it's going to be consistent across, and it's going to be, fading in the forester's tern. So darker in the center of the body, fading out to paler as you go closer to the wingtip in flight. But as they're perched, the common tern is going to have dark primaries as it's perched, and the primaries will look nice and bright white in the forester's tern while perched. In terms of call, we've got the two-parted key or call of the common tern versus the more monosyllabic keer of the forester's tern. Let's play the common first. And the forester's tern, keer. Okay, next up we've got our two alarm birds. We've got the Willet and the marbled Godwit. Both are very vocal, and if you encounter them, you are likely to hear them. The Willet says its name, goes Willet, Willet, and it also sings a variation, Pill Will Willet, Pill Will Willet. And the Willet. Ah, there. Especially in flight, the Willet is going to show these nice, bold wing patches here. Otherwise, it's a fairly gray, drab-looking, large shorebird. Marbled Godwit, on the other hand, has a longer, upturned, bicolored bill and has much warmer, brownish cinnamon tones, and also says its name, Godwit, Godwit, and variations on that theme. Okay. All right. And as promised, I was going to talk to you a little bit about the Saskatchewan piping plover census that's happening this year. The last time that it happened was in 2016, so it'll be great to get a lot of the basins surveyed again. So volunteers are needed, and most of the basins are in the Saskatoon area. So I'll show on a map here in a second, the location of those. But I know not everybody here is a beginner birder, so if you're feeling confident on your shorebird ID and you think you can, identify the very adorable little piping plover, I would encourage you to get in touch with Ashley Voss. She works for Nature Saskatchewan and she's the one coordinating the surveys. Her email is avass, so AVASS at naturesask.ca. The surveys are run between May 27th and June 16th, and the idea is in one day, a person or a group of people go and they scan and walk the shoreline of a basin. They're scanning for piping plovers, pairs of birds, and noting locations of nests and young if they're found. But the idea isn't necessarily to go in search of the nests because we want to disturb them as little as possible. But of course, if you happen to, notice young ones running around or happen to, spot a nest, of course, that's very useful information as well. But that's not so much the purpose. It's more scanning and seeing how many adults are around and if they're paired or if they're just singleton birds hanging out. So if you think you have the skills and what it takes, and want to, spend a day walking around a large, basin of a lake, I very much encourage you to get in touch with Ashley. And, I think this is maybe something that if, there's a, more experienced group going out that, you could always join in and, just another set of eyes is always helpful as well. So, consider doing that if you happen to live within striking distance of any of these pins. They are ranked in terms of priority for resurveying. So these are the basins that last time I talked to Ashley were still unassigned. So I'm already signed up to do one, and with the rest of my commitments, I can't do anymore. But there's two priority 2 basins, Allen Potash Mine and Muskegee Lake, and there's several priority 3 basins, Opuntia Lake, South Meacham area south, Radisson Lake, and near the Blaine Lakes. And there are 2 other priority 4, so much lower on the priority list, but there's an unnamed basin southeast of Landis and as well the Bradwell Reservoir. So, ooh, Lindsay says she's able to help out. Awesome. Get in touch with Ashley. I'll put this back up. So if anybody is interested in, wants to lend a hand, this is the kind of thing where, it's not done terribly frequently, so it's always good to, lend a hand if you can and just go out. It should be a fun day. Sometimes it might be long and potentially warm and shadeless, so keep that in mind. It's not all glamour, but it is fun, and it's kind of nice to get out with, a purpose in mind. So if you think you can help out with the Saskatchewan piping plover census this year, reach out to Ashley. Again, her email is avass@naturesask.ca. And if you forget her email address, you can always email me afterwards as well. So thank you all so much for attending this session. You can reach out to me at skatlas@birdscanada.org. You can visit the MarshWatch webpage on the Birds Canada website. There you'll find extra quizzes that you can do. I post the recordings up in a day or two after, for the most part, so you can go and rewatch anything. If your connection wasn't the greatest and you couldn't hear, you can always go back and re-listen. Sometimes it takes more than once to get that through your get it to sit well in your mind. You can always visit birdscanada.org to learn more about Birds Canada. We're on all the socials. We are a not-for-profit, so if you feel like you're able to make a donation, we always encourage you to do that. And a big thank you to our MarshWatch supporters who help fund programming like this. And this program specifically, we're going to be thanking the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. And thank you to you, the audience, for taking this in. I love delivering this. I hope you enjoy listening to it. It's a ton of fun, and I look forward to it every week.